You just finished Module 1 feeling great, and then Module 2 hits you with the most diabolical vocab on the SAT. You waste 4 minutes on one question trying to decipher words like recalcitrant or obsequious, and you cook yourself for the rest of the test. Straight up, some SAT vocab is luck. You can't guarantee every question, but if you use the strategies in this video, you'll seriously boost your odds and squeeze the maximum points out of the English section. Here's how we're going to beat these vocab questions. First, don't look at the answer choices. Read the sentence and ask yourself, if I had to fill in this blank in normal English, what kind of word belongs here? Fill the blank with a word that makes sense to you. Second, search for context clues. Look for contrast words like however, although, or but, and support words like because, therefore, and so. The sentence is basically telling you how you're supposed to feel about that word. Third, use process of elimination. Cross out anything that does not match with the word you selected earlier. And if you still don't have an answer by this point, guess the meaning of the word off its roots, prefixes, and suffixes. Even if you don't know the word irreverent, you might recognize the prefix of ear, which means not, and the root, which is revere, which means to respect. So when you put that together, you get not respectful. And finally, if you're totally lost, then just guess and move on. Don't spend more than 2 to 3 minutes on a vocab question because you're just wasting time at that point. Okay, so now that you understand the basics of how to go about answering these super difficult vocab questions, let's actually take a look at some example problems. But before we do that, just want to mention a quick couple of things. So, if you're enjoying the video so far, I would really appreciate if you could just engage with the video in any way. Liking, subscribing, commenting, all that stuff really tells the YouTube algorithm that you are enjoying the content. And I would really appreciate it if you could do that. Also, there's a PDF in the description of this video. It's like a Google Drive link. So you can download the questions that I'm going to do and practice them yourselves. And all the questions that you see in this video and all my other videos are from Tutoro, which is an SAT practice app. The link for that is also in the description if you want to take a free practice test or just do some practice. It's really helpful. And again, all the questions that you see are like unedited straight from Tutoro's question bank. So, with that all out of the way, let's get started with question one. So, while the concept of natural selection might seem straightforward at first glance, its actual mechanisms are far more blank, involving intricate interactions between genetics, environment, and population dynamics over vast spans of time. And I'm not going to read this part because, that's like the general stem attached to each question. We know this is a vocab question, so let's just lock in on that, right? So, it says, while the concept of natural selection might seem straightforward. So, seems straightforward on the surface, its actual mechanisms are far more blank, involving intricate interactions between genetics. So this is telling us that at first they are like easy, right? These like concepts are easy, but when you actually dive deeper, and this is an arrow. My bad for the bad handwriting. This is an arrow. When you dive deeper, they become more complicated because like it uses context clues like intricate and things like that. So we haven't looked at any of the answer choices yet, but the word that I would use to fill in the blank here is they're far more complicated. They're all right complex, just to save some space. So now we've used context clues and we've filled in the blank with something that makes sense to us. So let's look at the answer choices and try to figure out which one is most similar to our word. So transparent. Transparent means that it's easy to see, right? And obviously, complex and transparent, I would say, are opposite. So that's definitely not correct. Recondite. Okay, so I don't really know what recondite means to be perfectly honest. So I'm just gonna skip that for now. Also, whenever you see words that you don't know the meaning of, do not mark them as wrong. Just skip them and then come back to them later. Accessible. C. So again, that's the opposite of complex. because accessible, yeah, that's like it's would so accessible is the opposite of what our word should be, so that's definitely incorrect. And same with elementary, it's complex, not elementary. So by process of elimination, the only word that we have left is recondite. So recondite, yeah, I bet if you search it up, it means something like complex or complicated, something like that. Obviously, it doesn't have to exactly mean that. So you can get these questions right without even knowing what the correct answer means. So that's definitely a very important lesson. Okay, let's move on to question number two. So, despite the wealth of associated artifacts, the purpose of ceremonial masks remains stubbornly blank to researchers. Their intricate symbolism and varied cultural origins consistently eluded definitive explanation even after decades of intensive study. Which choice completes the text with the most logical and precise word or phrase? Okay, so despite the wealth of associated artifacts, so it's basically saying that they had, well, a wealth of associated artifacts means there were a lot of these artifacts. So, despite the fact that there were a lot of these artifacts, the purpose of these ceremonial masks remains stubbornly blank to researchers. And the second sentence, their intricate symbolism and varied cultural origins consistently eluded definitive explanation. Okay, so basically it's saying they had a lot of these artifacts, but they still couldn't figure out the purpose behind them. So I'm going to say for this blank, the purpose of the ceremonial masks remains stubbornly out of reach, I think is a good term to fill in the blank with, out of reach, because the researchers basically couldn't figure out what the purpose was. And that's evidenced by the fact that it eluded them. So the purpose eluded the researchers. So now that we have our blank filled in, let's look at our answer choices. So transparent, this doesn't really make much sense, right? Out of reach means that it's hard to see or hard to get to. Transparent is the opposite of that. Equivocal, so I don't really know exactly what this word means, but equiv sounds a lot like equivalent. So I'm gonna assume this means something similar to equivalent. So if I just plug equivalent into the blank, the purpose of these ceremonial masks remains stubbornly equivalent to researchers. Doesn't really make much sense. I'm gonna just cancel that. Discernible. So discern means that it's visible or it's noticeable. I think discern means that it's noticeable, and able means, well, it's possible. So it's basically possible to notice, possible to notice, and that doesn't really go with what we're saying here, right? We're saying that it's really hard to figure out and it's out of reach. So this also doesn't really make sense. So by process of elimination, inscrutable is the correct answer. So I mean, if we just break this down as well, in means not, and scrutable is actually pretty similar to discern. So I mean, scrutable kind of sounds like scrutinize. You can scrutinize something. You can like look at it closely. So scrutable probably means that like it's possible to figure out something along those lines, right? So it's not possible to figure out, not possible to figure out is what I would basically translate this word to mean, which makes a lot of sense, right? The purpose of the ceremonial masks remains stubbornly not possible to figure out to researchers. That makes sense, right? Obviously, grammatically, it's not perfectly correct, just because we're plugging in our own words there, but just like logically and intuitively, that makes sense. So if you said D for question two, you would be correct. Okay, question number three. While many art critics initially dismissed Impressionism as a merely fleeting trend, its enduring influence on subsequent art movements and its pervasive presence in major galleries today demonstrate that its impact was far from blank. Okay, so these art critics initially dismissed Impressionism as a fleeting trend. Fleeting is probably a very important word here. However, its enduring influence on subsequent art movements, so enduring influence, and its pervasive presence in major art galleries today demonstrate that its impact was far from blank. So basically, they started off by saying that it was a fleeting trend. So it was important because it was still a trend, right? So that means that it was still important, but it was only important for a small period of time because that's what fleeting means. Fleeting means that it was like short lasting. So that there was still a trend, but it was only very short lasting. But so that's what the first sentence says. The second sentence says that its enduring influence on subsequent art movements demonstrate that its impact was far from blank. So actually, I think fleeting is a good word to actually put inside of the blank, right? Because we know what fleeting means. We know that the first sentence says that they thought it was fleeting, but since it has an enduring influence, it's actually not fleeting, if that logic chain kind of makes sense. So now that we have the word in our blank, we know our context clues. Let's go through the answer choices. So our first answer choice is ephemeral. And I do know what that word means, but I'm sure many of you watching this don't because that's not a very common word. So I'm just going to skip it for now. B is profound. So, in major galleries today demonstrate that the impact was far from profound. Well, that's the opposite of what is true, right? It's enduring. It has an enduring influence. So that means that it was pretty important. So it was and far from. So we also need to take note of this far from. Far from basically means that whatever word is in the blank here, that basically you take the opposite of that word. So if we put profound in this blank, far from profound basically means that it's not profound or not important. But obviously, we know that it is important because it had that enduring influence. So profound is clearly not correct. Contentious means like to argue because I see like contention, almost contention. So, like, it's contending with something. I mean, it's not like the impressionism isn't really being compared against anything else. It's not really contending with something. It was far from contending. Yeah, that doesn't really make much sense. C is definitely wrong. It doesn't really match with fleeting either. Negligible. So negligible can make sense. So I'd say it's definitely between A or D, right? So if we just compare fleeting, right? Let me delete this. So ephemeral, I'm going to tell you all what that means. So ephemeral means that it was I did not spell that right. Ephemeral. It means that it's short lasting. Short lasting. So I mean, if we just compare ephemeral and fleeting, those basically mean the same thing. Oh yeah, I didn't even notice. Like they both mean the exact same thing. If you just look over here, they're both short lasting. So I would be pretty confident marking ephemeral as the correct choice here. So its impact was far from short lasting, which is the opposite of what the art critics say, which is what we want, right? That's what the blank should mean. So ephemeral is definitely correct. But now let's understand why negligible isn't. So negligible also kind of makes sense here, right? So if I delete fleeting, the impact was far from negligible. Negligible. So if the impact was far from negligible, that means that the movement was important. But I think what the art critics are saying, right? They're not saying that the trend. They're not saying that impressionism is not important. They're saying that it's important, but it was only important for a short period of time because that's why that word fleeting, the word fleeting is so very important here. It was important because a trend has to be something important, right? It was just important for a short period of time, so that would also make negligible incorrect. So ephemeral is correct there, but that was a pretty complicated problem. Like, I think that's a level above what you're going to see on the SAT. The SAT is a little bit easier because you don't have to go that deep into the logic, just understanding that stuff. But it's very important to practice these hard questions. So yeah, if you said ephemeral there, you would be correct. And just using our strategy, we can kind of figure out what the correct answer is. But I mean, for that one, it would be pretty difficult. And I wouldn't be upset if I got that question wrong if I were you, to be completely honest. But okay, let's move on to the fourth question. Despite a reputation for being a ruthless and pragmatic leader, Queen Elizabeth the first often employed diplomacy and strategic alliances to achieve her aims, preferring negotiation over open conflict whenever possible. Her carefully cultivated image as the Virgin Queen was not merely a personal affectation, but a shrewd political maneuver designed to blank her independence from foreign suitors and prevent internal power struggles. Therefore, her reign requires looking beyond simplistic narratives to appreciate the complex motivations behind her policies. Okay, so again, the words like despite are super important here. So let's just take note of our context clues following our strategy. So despite is pretty important. Despite a reputation for being ruthless. So they thought that she was ruthless, but she also often employed diplomacy and strategic alliances. All right. Preferring negotiation over open conflict, that's fine. Her carefully cultivated image was not merely a personal affectation, but a shrewd political maneuver designed to blank her independence. So okay, obviously being the queen, she wants to show that she's independent. So I would say emphasize is probably a good one. So she wants to emphasize her independence, right? She emphasizes her independence, and this prevents foreign suitors and internal power struggles from causing problems. So obviously, emphasize doesn't really fit in that blink, but I'm just gonna say emphasize is our word because she's trying to emphasize her independence. And yeah, and it's further backed up by the fact that she carefully cultivated her image as the Virgin Queen. So she's doing these shrewd political maneuvers to emphasize her independence. I think that makes sense. So underscore. And by the way, we're just going through the answer choices here. Underscore, I think that's pretty similar to emphasizing. It's like almost like underscore is pretty similar to underlining something, like the underscoring, underlining, same thing, right? So it's when you underline something, you emphasize it. So actually, I would say A makes a lot of sense here, but let's just look at the rest of them. So obscure the yeah, and every time you have an answer choice, just plug it into that blank, right? So the Virgin Queen was not merely a personal affectation, but a shrewd political maneuver designed to obscure her independence. No, she's trying to emphasize her independence so that she can like look powerful, right? So she doesn't want to obscure her independence, so that doesn't make sense. Same with diminish. She wants to increase her independence. D is circumvent. I don't really know. Yeah, so first of all, these two don't really connect at all. Emphasize and circumvent. Circumvent means to like go around something, right? So she doesn't want to go around her own independence. That doesn't really make sense either. So if you said A, you would be correct. And, like, as you can see, right, this is not like a very scientific process. There's no scientific way to get each answer choice correct. Like if you were in like math module 2, right, where you just solve the equations, like English doesn't really work that way. So you do need to do a lot of guessing and checking. And you're not gonna be absolutely sure of the correct answer every time. Just trust in the process, just stick with it, and, like, if you get a vocab question or 2 wrong, like, it's not the end of the world, right? So, yeah, just know that this is not a scientific process, so don't feel bad if it doesn't immediately make sense or if it doesn't feel correct, right? Just trust the process. But let's do the next question. All right, time for the last question. So, for centuries, astronomers considered the cosmos to be fundamentally uniform, with matter distributed evenly throughout. However, recent observations of large scale cosmic structures, such as galaxy superclusters and voids, suggest a more blank arrangement, prompting a reevaluation of the established cosmological models. So, first thing I want to highlight here is the reevaluation of the established cosmological models. And the established cosmological models are described in the first sentence. So, just 4 centuries, astronomers considered it to be fundamentally uniform. So, this should basically be the opposite of fundamental. The blank should be the opposite of fundamentally uniform. Or maybe not the opposite, but like something that's not related to fundamentally uniform. So, yeah, recent observations overturned this like long term consideration. So a more oh well, to be honest, like there are a bunch of different words that can fit in the blank here. So, but we just want to look for something that's not fundamentally uniform. And uniform just basically means that they're all the same, right? It's like if you imagine like a uniform like line, if you like just to give you an example of what uniform means, it's just like a flat line. It doesn't change at all. So fundamentally uniform I think is a key term because it's what the astronomers considered. And what the blank is asking about is a reevaluation of the established considerations. Models are basically considerations. So the opposite of fundamentally uniform is what we're looking for, or something similar. So A is amorphous. Not completely sure what that word means, so we'll move on. B is homogeneous. So most of you guys, I think most of you guys would know what this means. You go over it in science class, but homogeneous basically means that they are the same because homo is like the same. So if we look at the blank, let me get rid of all these highlights that are kind of annoying. So if you look at the blank, it says, however, recent observations of large-scale cosmic structures such as galaxy superclusters and voids suggest a more blank arrangement. So it says that they thought it was fundamentally uniform, but it's not fundamentally uniform. So homogeneous is going to be wrong because uniform and same are pretty closely related. So since homogeneous means the same, that probably doesn't really make sense. C, hierarchical. So, however, recent observations of large scale cosmic structures such as galaxy, superclusters, and voids suggest a more hierarchical arrangement. That does make sense. Uniform and hierarchical are not the same. So, this is like not the same as uniform because hierarchical obviously has like some sort of structure to it, right? It's structured, but uniform is just like flat. So, yeah, that makes sense. And then D is indiscriminate. Yeah, that doesn't really make sense here, right? So if I just read it again, such as galaxies, superclusters, and voids suggest a more indiscriminate arrangement. Well, indiscriminate basically means that like someone doesn't care, right? So let's say you're indiscriminately like choosing clothes to wear, right? You don't care about what clothes to wear. So that could make sense, but I think indiscriminate is a little bit more related to like thoughts. But obviously the arrangement of the universe doesn't really have any thoughts behind it, right? It's like a process that we can't explain. So indiscriminate doesn't really fit here compared to the other two answer choices that we have. So now let's try to figure out what amorphous means. So the prefix a means not. So that's pretty important to know. Amorphous. So morphous. So that sounds like morphing. Morphing is pretty similar to shape, right? So not doesn't have a shape, I think is a good way to put it. Doesn't have a shape or it's shapeless. So morph, yeah, you morph into something, right? So basically it doesn't morph into something because it's amorphous, so it doesn't really have a shape. Those are pretty related in my mind at least. So now we just have to figure out which one makes more sense. So, however, recent observations of large-scale cosmic structures such as galaxies, superclusters, and voids suggest a more shapeless arrangement. That could work actually, but shapeless doesn't seem correct because they still have a shape, right? It's a galaxy supercluster, and if it's a cluster, it has some sort of shape, right? So I don't think amorphous is correct. Hierarchical makes sense because it's not uniform, but it still has a shape. And I think that fits the best within the parameters of the question. Like if it said something like completely like scattered around or something like that, then amorphous could make sense. But since it describes these cosmic structures, and there's structures as well, actually, that's probably important. So these structures, if it's a structure, it has to have some sort of shape, right? So amorphous, I think is close, but it's not quite there because of the couple of those context clues like structures and galaxy superclusters. So yeah, I would say hierarchical works because of process of elimination, but this question was also very difficult. And I'd say that's a little bit harder than what you're going to see on your SAT. But again, it's good to practice these hard questions, right? So, yeah, I think that's all I have for this video. If you have any particular questions or comments, Just drop them in the comments below. Remember, if you want more hard questions to practice like this, where you really have to think about it, then go to tutorial.app. Links in the description. You can take a free practice test today. And yeah, if you enjoy the video, please make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want any help with math, I already have a bunch of videos on my channel for that. So you can go and check those out as well. All right. See y'all next time.